On today's World Insight, China, the U.S., and 38 other nations meet at the climate summit. We find out what has been achieved and what remains outstanding in the climate fight. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin with the Leaders Climate Summit, in which dozens of world leaders have virtually come together for a common goal: to pull back from the tipping point of climate change. At the invitation of U.S. President Joe Biden, Chinese President Xi Jinping attended the summit and delivered a key speech via video. President Xi talked about China's efforts to scale back greenhouse gas emissions. He said China would phase down coal use from 2026 to 2030. Xi also called for global action to build a community of life for man and nature with social equity and justice in the green transition. He said countries should honor their climate commitments. China seeks to peak carbon emissions by 2030 and to become carbon neutral by 2060. At the summit, U.S. President Joe Biden has pledged to cut the greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by the year 2030. How achievable are these climate targets? What about other countries? What's the next for global green governance? We bring a panel of different voices coming from China, U.S., Japan, and India. Take a look. For more on the climate summit, in Tokyo, we have Yusen Asuka, professor of Tohoku University from Graduate School of Environment Science. In New Delhi, Muku Samwal, former director of the Climate Change Secretariat. In Boston, Michael Melling, deputy director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research with MIT. Last but not least, in Beijing, Zhang Jianyu, chief representative of the Environmental Defense Fund China program. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. A lot to cover today. First of all, takeaway from the Leaders Summit on climate change. Mr. Zhang.
Well, I think it's really big. I think 5 years, world leaders finally came and sit down and talk with each other on a common cause, which is climate change. Secondly, U.S. and China, the two largest emitters of the carbon dioxide in the world, were able to renew and make new bold pledges.
What are the two pledges that you are referring to, Mr. Zhang?
Oh, I'm talking about the pledges by the U.S., updated NDC to 50 to 52%. On China, the first time to make the pledge to control of the coal use and cut down of total coal consumption.
Now, and I go to you, Mr. Melling, for that as well. About the U.S. commitment, what exactly is it? What does that mean? And what does it mean when it comes to the implementation of these goals?
So it is, as Mr. Zhang already said, it's the update of the nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. The last time the U.S. submitted one of these was in 2015, ahead of the Paris Agreement being adopted, which had a much weaker target for 2025. And now we have a target of 50 to 52% of net greenhouse gas emission reductions relative to 2005 emissions by 2030. And that is much, much closer to what some other advanced economies, like, say, the European Union have pledged. And it changes very much, I think, how the U.S. is perceived on this in this game, in the arena.
But there were problems earlier about the U.S. implementation, even with the earlier goals. So a lot of question about whether these are goals only or these are real goals for implementation.
It's a bit of both. Rhetoric matters. The statements do have importance, but you're absolutely right when you're hinting at the fact that these are only long-term targets that are pledged, that are aspirationally committed to. The actual implementation is a very different game, and the short-term politics of getting legislation, of getting executive action through in order to get on the pathway towards achieving this new NDC, that's going to be much, much harder.
Thank you for your analysis. Let me go to you, Professor Asuka. In Japan. Japan already pledged the 2050 carbon neutral. Where is the roadmap? How far are you from it?
We are very far from it, and Prime Minister Suga committed 46% reduction in 2030 yesterday, but it's not consistent with 2050 target. So we are still behind that kind of proper roadmap to 2050 carbon neutral.
What do you mean by it is not yet in accordance with the 2050? What exactly are you referring to?
Previous commitment was 27% compared to 2013, and that is base year, so much better than previous target. But the point is, base year is 2013, and in case of, for example, UK, 1990. So we recalculate the target of Japan based on 1990. It's only 40%, so it's not ambitious enough.
Let me go to you, Mr. Sanvo. What is your take from the summit meeting?
I think the most important thing about climate change is that it impacts people differently. So when you looked at, when we heard the statements of all the countries there, right from the richest to the poorest, the largest to the smallest, it became very clear that the issues facing the world as a whole is not just emissions reduction, but also adaptation to the adverse effects of climate change. I think that was a very big takeaway, especially from the small island states in Africa. The second issue I think that came out very clearly was that people are looking at their commitments in the context of their national circumstances. Take the case of the United States. The United States is using 2005 as the base year, not 1990 as others are doing, which means that its emissions peaked in 2005. And that makes a difference to the calculation. We just heard a colleague from Japan making that point. The third point I think comes out clearly is that very few countries have specified how they are going to achieve this. And that I think is going to be critical for the United States as well. Because please remember that neither the Kyoto Protocol nor the Paris Agreement has been ratified by the Senate. The way the United States system works, and where most countries work, is that you have to have legislative backing and not executive action.
Right.
Executive action means policy can be reversed. It happened with President Bush, it happened with President Trump, twice it's happened before. Now the key issue for the United States will be, what does the Senate do?
Yeah, great point there. Great point there.
And then the other issue comes out is that China, for example, has been very clear. No more new coal plants after 2025. It has made 2 points. They have said very clearly that we need coal for the base load, because half of manufacturing emissions of China and India are steel and cement, which you need for infrastructure and which has no substitute. But they have made the point that after 2025, we will shift. And we cannot shift till 2025 because our infrastructure and manufacturing still has to grow. So just the United States has said 2005, they have said 2020. I think that is the kind of calculations we need to take, not in terms of percentages and targets, but to understand the circumstances of the countries, to make an assessment as to how serious they are and whether they will be able to fulfill what they are saying, because that is important for other countries.
Let me go into this discussion. What people have pledged, are they inspirational goals, or are they goals that are going to be implemented, given your expert knowledge? Mr. Zhang, about coal, China pledged at this time 14th five-year plan and 15th five-year plan. For others, this is very technical. Maybe you want to explain what does it really mean.
Yeah, the issue is about coal. So let's put that into perspective. Coal accounts for about 57% of our entire energy mix and also accounts for about 68% of the power generation. So you can imagine what a backstone and a major source of energy and the role that coal plays into the economy. So as our Indian colleague just pointed out, that the pledge that China, the renewed pledge China made, in addition to what President Xi announced on September the 12th last year, with regard to the overall goals, carbon intensity, total amount of the renewables, carbon sink. But this time, I think China made it very clear that it will target on this very issue, first, to strictly control the coal-fired power generation in the 14th five-year plan and throughout. Second, to strictly contain the increase of coal consumption in the 14th five-year plan. And third, to reduce the total amount of coal consumption in the 15th five-year plan, which is from 2025 to 2030.
I think there is a very clear commitment about the coal, but what does that really mean? Because there are other factors that we have to think about. For example, what does it mean for the jobs? 30 million people are in the coal power plant related industries. What does it mean for the other industries and the people, livelihood? These are all gigantic questions that have to be taken into consideration. Mr. Zhang, as an environmentalist, do you have suggestions?
Definitely. I'm an environmentalist, but I'm also a practitioner. I care about the final outcome, not just for the slogan, not just talk the talk, but more importantly is walk the walk. Now, I think the issue you highlighted is very important. It's actually not just about the coal industry itself, but also about all the other sectors, the secondary sectors or the service sectors that has been around the entire energy sector that is going to undergo this very tremendous, significant, transformative changes once the pledge is made and to be implemented. But I think the advantage of the Chinese economy is that we are a hybrid of planned economy and also market-based economy. The central government has really strong power to implement whatever they decide to do, what they promise. You can get a glimpse of that from just issued the guiding principle for the 14th five-year plan and 2035 vision that I think China's government, if you look at actually into the details of the 14th five-year plan, you will see green has become the main theme of the word in all the parts of the 14th five-year plan. It's no longer just in the environmental section. It's no longer just in the climate section. It's actually all over the place.
It's holistic.
So I think the plan is there. That is, the whole society needs to be geared up and to prepare and to really to help to facilitate this transformative change.
A lot of things are already happening. This morning when I was looking at my moments on my WeChat account, there are already industry leaders pledging their specific plans, detailed, strategic, specific implementation plans from now until the 2030 of their industries. Go to you, Mr. Melling. Two things. One is about political process in the U.S. and the cycle dealing with climate change. We see that, which our Indian colleague, Mr. Sanwal, also mentioned. First of all, would you like to respond to that?
I share his concern that the commitment to international climate cooperation has been occurring under the Obama administration, now under the Biden administration, in the form of executive action, not ratification by the Senate. The problem is,
and big interval in between, by the way, by the Trump administration, totally withdrawing even from the platform.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So when you don't have Senate ratification, a new administration can change things after an election, just sending a letter to the UNFCCC Secretariat. Yeah. However, the reality is that to get ratification in the Senate, you would need 66 votes, a 2/3 majority. That is not practical. That is not going to happen in the near future. And so we have to work with what we have, and that is executive acceptance of, for instance, the Paris Agreement, an executive act to submit the NDC, and so on and so forth. That's the best we have, and we have to hope that it will be enough.
Yeah. So you are saying there's likely to be another earthquake, let's just say 4 years from now, if politics change much in terms of the direction, which party is in power after that. Is that what you're trying to say?
I think none of us can speculate what the outcomes of future elections will be, but I certainly think that we have to be prepared to go 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I think one of the important pieces here is exactly what you mentioned earlier in your question to Mr. Zhang, the acceptance in the population of this transformation, how we deal with the transitions from existing coal jobs or fossil fuel jobs and create a perspective, a future for these communities in the new clean energy economy will be very, very important to ensure sustainability of these political decisions.
Fossil fuel lobbying in the US is very strong, as we all know, throughout history. But now, green lobbying is also very strong from one way or another. Mr. Melding, how do you see this, different directions of arguments and debates and all the interest groups involved?
Well, 10 years ago, if you had looked at sort of the amount of money invested from fossil fuel lobbying groups like the American Petroleum Institute and others, and compared that to the amount of money invested by green civil society organizations such as Environmental Defense Fund, which Mr. Zhang represents, there was clearly, it was very asymmetrical, and fossil fuel had much, much more investment, much more activity there. That has changed. And I think one can really also see how with declining market capitalization, with declining sort of opportunities going forward for the fossil fuel sector, that their influence in politics has shifted towards and in favor of the clean energy companies and groups and so on and so forth, which is, I think, very important and very positive.
Yeah. Well, the world is not just made of China and the United States. Unfortunately, it is not just the two countries, but many others that are participating and contributing. Mr. Senvol, I want to come to you for India, one of the largest emerging economies. Well, China and India, together with other developing emerging economies, has been emphasizing on common but differentiated responsibilities. You made that clear also in your early argument. How do you see the next step for India, for example?
What has happened is that the world has moved on from 1990, when the climate change treaty was being negotiated and finalized in 1922. And now the emphasis of the word common but differentiated responsibility itself has changed more towards the timing of when countries will peak and how much they will, at what level they will peak, and what would happen after they peaked. Now, what has happened here is that for the developed countries, the industrialized countries, there is a clear peaking. For the European Union, it took place around 1990. For the United States, it is 2005. For Japan, we've just heard 2013. Now, China, India, and other developing countries are different because we are still growing. And a lot of that trajectory of our growth has also shifted towards sustainability. So while China is going to say peak, we heard its coal use in 2025, but that does not mean that its emissions will peak in 2025, because there will still be emissions coming from the growth of the middle class in cities, more automobiles, and other factors of that kind. While new technology is also coming into force in terms of renewable energy. So for the developing countries, the trajectory of growth itself has shifted, unlike that, unlike the West. So we need to have a very different parameter when we look at developing countries, China, India, and the others. That's my first point. My second point is that when we get into the details, you find that the structure is very different. The values, the civilizational emphasis of what is well-being is very different. For example, United States, 30% of emissions are automobiles. Out of 1,000 population, 800 automobiles. China, I think for 1,000 population, it is 100. India, it is 1/3 of that. Now, the question before the world is really, are China, India, and other developing countries going to converge on the lifestyles or the aspirations or the kind of civilization of the West? My own work has shown very clearly that that is not going to happen. Now, if that is not going to happen, then the global models also fail us, because global models assume convergence. Basically, what is happening is that there are different ways countries are looking at economic growth.
Great arguments, but I have to also remind you, because India joined the Paris Agreement, and India also is part of the overall environmental climate change platform, a member of it. So, on the one hand, you are part of it. On the other hand, you keep on mentioning about the differences and the reluctance to commit. At this point, I think it's quite interesting. Could you help us to resolve these two facts together?
Yes. Now, that was the background. Now, what happened? What are the Paris commitments of, say, China, India, and the United States and Europe? while the Europeans and the United States are looking at moving towards zero net emissions or peaking and decline after that. The Paris commitments of China and India are in terms of percentage, reducing their energy intensity or GHG intensity. Basically, what they are saying is that when we will grow in a more sustainable manner.
Could you give one or two examples? What does that mean?
Yeah. Okay. What it means really is that when the United States or Europe says that we are going to reduce 50% from a certain number, it means that they have peaked.
Yes.
And whatever emissions they had at that point of time, in 2020 or 2030, they are going to be 50% less than that number. What China and India have said as part of their Paris commitments is that our energy efficiency will be better. We will use less energy for each percentage point of economic growth.
And what does that mean for India? Do you have a number for us?
Broadly, China and India are both saying that we will reduce 30% energy efficiency. Broadly, will be 30%.
Professor Asuka from Japan, also one of the industrial countries, but the environmental awareness within Japan is very high. Tell me more about what role is Japan likely to play, particularly in this environment in which it is not just climate change that we're talking about. We're also seeing other factors coming into this. For example, geopolitics, big power relations, regional issues. All of this are actually reflected in somewhat on the issues we talk about. Professor Asuka.
Thank you very much. I don't think Japanese environmental awareness is high compared to other countries. Of course, you may find some beautiful scenery, clean city, something like that. But when we talk about climate change, I think it's not same. And I don't think people in Japan are very aware about the climate change so much. And that's why I would say, because we just heard from India and US, and in Japan, many people say or use US and China and India as a scapegoat to do nothing in Japan domestically. So that's the situation in Japan. So we have to change, and we need more kind of international pressure. So don't say Japan is very environmentally aware, good countries. About the society, yes, it's very complex, have a lot of impact on many aspects of the society. But again, the problem is we also have vested interest on coal.
Yes.
So many people who are still making money from coal power plant, they want to keep. So that kind of fight is going on in Japan.
Thank you, Professor Asuka, for bringing us all the updates. Because we're at the time of the pandemic, people could hardly travel. We really depend on every one of you to bring us the freshness from the latest on the front. Before we go, very briefly from the two of you, I only have 1 minute left. Mr. Zhang and Mr. Melling. China-US talk about 8 areas. Which areas of cooperation do you see as has the biggest potential? They said that in the joint statement and also the discussion between the special envoys. Mr. Zhang, 30 seconds for you.
Well, I think the significance is China and US commits to work on something that has the most imminent impact on the climate change, in addition to carbon dioxide itself. So the Kigali Amendment, both sides agreed to work on. The methane, both of them have been proved to have a humongous impact on the immediate impact of warming that we're suffering. I think that's quite significant. That's also proof both countries treating this really as an existential threat that they need to team up together and to work on it.
Mr. Mellick, 30 seconds.
I concur with Mr. Zhang that cooperation on short-lived climate forces, on HFCs in particular, is absolutely critical. And the other area where I think the discussion between Xi Jinping and John Kerry was pointing in an important direction is on climate finance. And I'm not talking about finance of climate action, but in fact, financing of energy projects, investment in energy generation assets abroad. especially trying to steer away from investment in fossil fuel projects, in coal-fired power plants, etc. I think that's going to be really important around the world.
Michael Melling, Jason Asuka, Muku Sanwo, Zhang Jianyu. Gentlemen, thank you enormously for helping us to understand what's really behind that is taking place right now. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Stay with us. Coming up, my talks with leaders from various walks of life on the latest developments on fighting against climate crisis. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. As we speak, the Leaders Summit on Climate is still being held virtually. 40 leaders, including Chinese President Xi Jinping, are attending the meeting hosted by the U.S. Chinese President Xi Jinping wants deeper global cooperation on green development. U.S. President Joe Biden has committed the country to global efforts to address climate change. Biden said he wants to build critical infrastructure to produce and deploy clean technology. So what are the next practical steps for different countries in the battle against the climate change? Today, we bring you an interview series with key figures on these crucial issues. Madam Director General, you are coming into the office as one of the most challenging times in WTO history. And many issues that has been long there and not solved now are facing you all at the same time. What is the priority? Where to begin with?
Well, the beginning point for us, for the WTO, is helping to solve the problems that the world is facing at this time. And right now, the world is facing a problem of a pandemic. And the WTO has a role to play in two ways. One, the issue of export restrictions and prohibitions that may hinder the supply chain. As you know, the supply chain for vaccines is very complicated. I think next is the fisheries subsidies negotiation, which speaks to helping with the sustainability of our oceans and our fish stocks. SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 14.6. This negotiation has been going on for 20 years, and it is time to deliver. I've said 20 years is enough. So WTO members have to deliver this year in order to support the Sustainable Development Goals.
There are numbers that are suggesting the amount of financial investment I'm talking about all over the world so far about the green, with the name of the green, only 3% eventually brings real results of green development.
Right.
That to us is a very interesting, if not a challenging number.
Yeah.
So how to make sure it's not just a green wash?
Well, I think it's going to depend very much on what your definition of green is. This green definition, once again, it has to be built multilaterally. We want to make sure that no country imposes what the green is to the rest of the world.
What is ESG, right?
Yeah, ESG. I mean, ESG is something that is also the result of a collective construction. I mean, we have to have common rules. If we're talking about international law, and ESG offers benchmarks, then it has to be built multilaterally as well. When I was a young diplomat, I worked at the Brazilian delegation to the United Nations in New York, and sometimes I was a little frustrated with the pace of multilateralism, but when I thought deeper about it, I said every other alternative is worse.
Yeah.
But on the issue of green, what I wanted to share with you, Tian Wei, is that in the same sense that in the past we used to look at physical infrastructure on the one hand and technological infrastructure on the other, as if they were two separate things, reality is bringing them together. There is a kind of a fusion, there is a merger between physical infrastructure and technological infrastructure. So it is wrong for you to say that, for example, your institution has to have a special perspective to technology, because technology is everywhere. The same thing about what is green, the same thing about what is sustainable. So if you're talking about, say, building railways, there's something green about it, right? It can be more green or less green when it comes to conceiving the project, to the ESG criteria that you're using, the sort of references that you have, the local associates that you can relate to so that the implementation is the best one possible. So no matter what area of infrastructure you're talking about, there's something green about it. Of course, there's green finance, so it's going out there in the market and say, listen, we want to raise resources. It's in the spirit of the times. I think there's lots of resources that are available for that, and institutions such as ours can do that. But when it comes to project implementation, obviously there are areas like clean energy that are more obviously related to carbon neutrality and to going green. But even if you're talking about other areas like public transportation through buses, there is a lot of green work that can be done there. So we got to make sure that this is holistic, that this is omnipresent, both in terms of the sustainability aspect as well as the technological aspects. Otherwise, we're going to miss out on another opportunity, which is to use these technologies that are so widely disseminated to the benefit of traditional infrastructure.
Now, here's one thing, the North and South thing. I know it's not necessarily the freshest topic. The climate talk has been so hard to achieve any consensus because developing countries and developed countries have very different history in terms of how they tapped into the world's resources and has been polluting the world, so to speak.
The question is very fair. We got to go dirty before we really fully understood the implications to the climate of dirty. A lot longer than any developing country. So our obligation, it seems to me, is to grow clean faster and use our leverage to bring the price of clean green technologies down, precisely so the South countries, the developing countries, can get access to them, deploy them profitably. What I like about what you and I are doing right now, what John Kerry is doing with his Chinese counterparts, is we're engaging in what I call the Earth race. You know, in the 60s, America and the Soviet Union had the space race.
Right.
Who could be the first to put a man on the moon or a woman on the moon? What China and America need to have is the Earth race, where we compete with each other for who can invent the most clean green technologies so men and women, plants and animals, can stay here healthily on Earth.
First of all, China's commitment 2030 to carbon zero and 2060 to carbon neutrality. How much sincerity do you think, Mr. Ambassador, China has already demonstrated?
I highly compliment China for setting those dates, setting those goals. For anybody can achieve something, it's better that she has a goal and a definable goal, a definable date. It's zero carbon, that's very definable. Now, it's going to be difficult, obviously. There's some in the United States who might say, oh, China's just saying that. That's just words. That's just smokescreen. It's not reality. But I disagree with those. I know China well enough to know that they mean it.
The other point, whether China is going to use the climate change interactions as a bargaining chip, from this part of the world, the thinking and the logic is different. Thinking are not categorized into closed boxes, but rather everything seems to be interlinked, even philosophically in a way. And therefore, people would argue when the man-made environment, climate, has becoming soured and poisonous, can the climate change about our nature really be handled with real cooperation? That, I think, is a legitimate question to be asked too.
Tianwei, you make a very, very good point. It should be delinked. It's not be linked. We should address climate on its own. I think there's way, way too much linkage in too many domestic, industrial, and foreign policy areas in the world today. And I think that's partly because of the internet, because of the instantaneous nature of communication today. It tends to force more linkage. It's very dangerous. It's very dangerous because the more issues are linked, the more we face paralysis, the more we can't solve anything.
On the other hand, though, the environment in which, you know, whether negotiators or special envoys could talk to each other. Out of poisonous atmosphere, how much can they work on together?
This is not what diplomats usually do.
Yeah.
This is not what countries usually do. But I think if China or the United States were to unilaterally take the first step and show what it's doing to address climate change, and not asking for reciprocity, just show, because that will indicate good faith. Now, some might say, well, gee, you're being a sucker if you just take the first step and don't ask for reciprocity. I don't agree with that. I think it's very, if one country were to take the first step, that would be recognized by the other country and worldwide. And it tends to reduce tension. Each country knows better how to address it, what areas it can maybe take the first step on and what not. But I think that's important.
David Graybeard was the first chimpanzee who lost his fear of this peculiar white ape, which is what I was. They'd never seen a white ape before. And so gradually, because he got used to me, I'd approach a group in the forest, and they were all ready to run as usual, and then they would see David sitting calmly, and they'd look from him to me and back, and I suppose they thought, well, she can't be so dangerous after all. So he really introduced me to his friends out in the forest. David was gentle.
Really?
He was a born leader, not because he was aggressive in getting to the top, but because he was so quick to reassure that the young ones would want to follow him, just because he was a good chap to be around.
Did you try to communicate with him about that community that which you became part of?
No, you can't. I never tried to communicate with them. On the other hand, on one occasion when I was following him through the forest, I thought I'd lost him. And then I had to crawl through this tangle of vines and stuff. And he was sitting almost as though waiting for me. And so I sat down near him, and there was a ripe palm nut on the ground. So I held it towards him, and he turned away. He obviously didn't want it. So I put my hand closer, and he looked directly into my eyes. He took the nut. He dropped it. He didn't want it, but very gently squeezed my fingers. That's how chimpanzees reassure each other. So in that one moment, we communicated with each other in a language that surely predates human words. When I went out to Gombe, I hadn't been to college. I didn't know what was going to happen. I saved up my money. I got to Africa. I had this luck, or whatever, of meeting Louis Leakey, and he's the one who gave me this opportunity to go and be with chimpanzees. So at that time, I didn't have another world. But after about 2 years, Louis wrote to me and said, I won't always be around to get money for you. You're going to have to get a degree. We don't have time to mess about with a BA. You're going to have to go straight for a PhD. I've got your place in Cambridge University. To do a PhD in ethology. I didn't even know what ethology was. I'd never been to college. So when I got there, I was a bit nervous, as you can probably imagine. And to be told by these professors that I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have given the chimpanzees names. They should have had numbers. That would be scientific. I couldn't talk about them having personalities, minds capable of thought, and certainly not emotions, because those were unique to humans. But luckily, as a child, I had a teacher who taught me that for all their learning, these professors were completely wrong. And that teacher was my dog, Rusty. And you can't share your life in a meaningful way with a dog or a cat or a rabbit or a horse, I don't care what it is, and not know that of course animals have personalities. But thank goodness, because chimpanzees are biologically so like us, I was able to break that perception and help people, including science, to realize we are part of and not separated from the rest of the animal kingdom, and we should treat the other animals with a lot more respect and understanding.
Crucial information from leaders of all walks of life on green development and fighting climate crisis. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.